The small German village of Wittenberg was once a peaceful haven, its fields lush with the promise of harvests to come, its people working the land in relative serenity. But all that had changed. The war had come crashing through their lives like a violent storm, and now only the echoes of that peace remained, whispers of a time before the chaos. The familiar landscape had been scarred by constant bombardment, leaving behind a jagged, unrecognizable terrain where once vibrant homes had crumbled into dust and twisted metal. For young Karl, the war was a presence as real and suffocating as the air he breathed. It was not just a war of armies and tanks, but of terror and fear that invaded his every waking moment. Karl was only 11, too young to fully understand the weight of the conflict, yet old enough to feel its crushing grip. His father, once a sturdy pillar of the family, had long been sent off to fight, his absence leaving a void that neither Karl nor his mother could fill. She, too, was distant, though not out of coldness, but because she had no words left. The pain of loss had already begun to eat away at her, and all that remained was the shell of a woman who silently endured each passing day, weighed down by the knowledge that their family's survival depended not on strength, but on hiding from the ever-encroaching shadows of destruction. Karl's world was shaped by fear, the fear of the air raids that had become as regular as the setting sun. Every siren that screamed through the skies sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins, urging him to find cover, to hide, to escape the inevitable. His mind would race, conjuring images of death, his small body torn apart by bombs, or perhaps crushed beneath the weight of a collapsing building. The sound of airplanes, first the distant hum, then the terrifying roar, was enough to send him running in panic, eyes wide with terror, searching for a place to hide. He often retreated to the cramped cellar beneath their house, the small space filled with the scent of damp earth and mold. It was dark, suffocating, and silent except for the rhythmic thumping of his own heartbeat. But even there, in the pitch-black shadows of his hiding place, Karl couldn't escape the sounds that reverberated through the ground, the heavy thuds of distant explosions, the screams of people in the streets, the cries of mothers calling for their children, the groans of the wounded. The earth seemed to tremble with each bomb that fell, a harsh reminder of the world outside, a world that had turned into an endless nightmare. As the war continued, Karl began to see the changes in the people around him, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, their bodies worn thin by hunger and fear. They moved like ghosts, their once strong spirits now crushed by the weight of conflict. It was as though the very fabric of humanity had been torn apart, leaving only the remnants of what had once been. Even the soldiers who marched through the village, though they had been German, carried with them an air of uncertainty, their faces grim and gaunt, as if they, too, were aware of the futility of their actions. Karl, however, had no time for such thoughts. His mind was consumed by one thing: survival. He had learned early on that survival was not a matter of courage, but of avoidance. To survive, you needed to be invisible. You needed to be as silent as the wind, unnoticed and forgotten, hiding from those who could bring harm. It was an existence that twisted the mind, leaving behind a constant, gnawing fear. The world outside seemed both impossibly close and impossibly distant, within reach, yet forever out of his control. But the most terrifying part of his existence wasn't the bombs or the soldiers. It was the thought of the British, the looming presence of the enemy that Karl had been taught to hate, to fear, above all else. They were the ones who would finish the job, he was told, the ones who would come and bring an end to everything. His teachers spoke of them with disdain, their voices filled with venom as they described the horrors that would follow if the British ever set foot on German soil. Karl had never seen a British soldier, but the stories painted them as monstrous figures, brutal, merciless, and unfeeling. They were the enemy, and the enemy was to be feared above all else. It wasn't just the adults who fed this fear into Karl's mind. The children, too, whispered in the streets, their voices trembling as they shared tales of what would happen if the British came to their village. Some said the soldiers would burn the homes to the ground, others that they would round up the children and send them off to fight. The stories twisted in his mind, each one more horrific than the last. The thought of facing a British soldier was more than Karl could bear. He could see them in his nightmares, tall, cold-eyed men with weapons drawn, their faces cruel and unyielding. It was in this state of near paranoia that Carl's life continued, day after day, marked only by the rising sun and the endless roar of the war that never seemed to end. The world had become a place where safety was a distant memory, and fear was the only constant companion. But even in the midst of this, Carl clung to something. The hope, the desperate hope, that his father would return, that he would come back and take them away from this madness, away from the devastation. It was a fragile hope, but it was all he had. It was what kept him from completely succumbing to the terror that gnawed at him. And then, one day, the air raid sirens blared again. But this time, it was different. The sound was closer, louder, more insistent. Carl's heart raced as he bolted from the cellar, his eyes scanning the sky. The planes were above them, but there was no explosion, no fireball tearing apart the ground. Instead, the sound of the engines grew louder, and with it, a different kind of fear surged within him. The fear of what would come after the bombings, the fear of the soldiers who would follow. As the planes disappeared into the distance, Carl stood frozen in the middle of the street, his breath shallow, his body trembling. He had heard the stories. He knew what was coming. The British were near. And he was not prepared for what they would do to him. It was a feeling like no other, a feeling of complete helplessness, of being small in a world that had grown far too large and violent. The ground beneath his feet seemed unstable, as though it might crack open and swallow him whole. His hands shook as he clenched them into fists, imagining the brutality that was about to unfold. Every instinct told him to run, to hide, to disappear into the shadows. But where could he go? What good would hiding do? They would find him, just as they had found everyone else. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the broken streets, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that the end was near, that this would be the moment when everything would change forever. He wanted to believe that his fear was overblown, that he was just another child caught in the tide of panic that gripped the village, but deep down he knew. This was different. This was the moment when the real terror would arrive. The British were coming. And with them, Carl feared, his worst nightmares would come to life. The early morning fog hung heavy over Wittenberg, cloaking the village in a gray shroud that seemed to mirror the hopelessness that had settled in the hearts of its people. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and smoke, a combination that was now as familiar as the sound of distant explosions that reverberated through the hills. Carl, still too young to fully grasp the intricacies of war, felt its presence keenly in every corner of his life. He had grown up in the shadow of fear, and as the days passed, that shadow only seemed to stretch longer, darker, and more suffocating. His mother had become a figure of resignation, her movements slow and deliberate as if weighed down by an unseen burden. She would go about the house, gathering what little food they had left, speaking only when necessary, and then retreating back into her own thoughts. Carl had learned to stop asking questions, knowing that the answers were as empty as the promises of peace his father had once spoken. The war had torn through everything, the sense of security, the rhythms of daily life, and left nothing but an aching, gnawing emptiness in its wake. But there was one thing that still clung to Carl, one thread that connected him to a world that felt increasingly distant, the fear of the British. The stories, the rumors, the whispered warnings, they all pointed to the same undeniable truth. The British would come, and when they did, it would mean the end of everything. They were the invaders, the destroyers, the ones who would show no mercy. His teachers had instilled in him the same lessons, their words sharp and filled with hatred. The British, they said, are savages who will leave nothing but ruin in their wake. They will show you no compassion. They are the enemies of everything we stand for. Carl didn't know exactly what that meant, but he understood the weight of the words. The British were the other, the foreign enemy that needed to be feared and fought. They were the ones who would destroy his world. And in the pit of his stomach, he could already feel the trembling anxiety that came with the certainty of their arrival. The morning passed quietly enough, with only the distant hum of planes in the sky, but it wasn't long before the first signs of change began to appear. The soldiers, who had long been a steady presence in the village, seemed on edge, their movements more hurried, their conversations more tense. Carl watched them from the window of their home, his small frame pressed against the cold glass as he strained to catch glimpses of what was unfolding outside. The soldiers, dressed in their dark, imposing uniforms, hurried past the broken homes and empty streets, their eyes scanning every corner as though anticipating danger from every shadow. It was then that the first rumors began to circulate, quietly at first, in hushed voices between the villagers. The British were coming. The enemy had crossed the border. They were marching toward Wittenberg. Carl's heart skipped a beat. The words echoed in his mind, too terrifying to believe but too real to ignore. The British were near, and there was nothing left to do but brace for the inevitable. Panic rippled through the village like a silent wave. The adults gathered in small groups, whispering anxiously about what would happen when the British arrived. Some said they would raze the village to the ground, others that they would take the women and children and send them to camps. But all agreed on one thing: the British would show no mercy. The terror was palpable, so thick that it seemed to settle over every conversation, every movement. Carl could hear the urgency in the voices of the adults, the tightness in their words, as if they were trying to convince themselves that there was still hope, that somehow they could survive this. But there was no hope left, not in this place, not in this war. Carl's mind raced as the hours passed, his thoughts a swirling mess of fear and confusion. What would it be like when the British came? Would they burn everything down just like in the stories? Would they take him away from his mother, tear him from the safety of their home? The images danced in his head, soldiers with guns, flames engulfing the buildings, people running through the streets in terror. He could already hear the distant rumble of their boots, the harsh commands barked in a language he couldn't understand, but that felt somehow colder, more menacing than any language he knew. In the late afternoon, the first sign of the British soldiers became undeniable. A distant rumble reached Carl's ears, followed by the unmistakable sound of military vehicles moving through the fields just beyond the village. His heart thudded in his chest, a steady drumbeat of fear as the sounds drew closer. The ground trembled under the weight of their presence. Carl's pulse quickened, his breath shallow, as he backed away from the window, retreating into the darkness of the house. He could hear his mother's footsteps echo in the hallway as she moved toward the back of the house, as if preparing for the worst, ready to face whatever came. But Carl couldn't bring himself to follow her. He stood there in the silence, alone with his thoughts, paralyzed by the looming terror that now seemed all but certain. As the soldiers approached the village, Carl's mind reeled with 1,000 questions. What would happen now? What were they going to do? Was this the end? It wasn't just the bombs or the explosions that terrified him now, but the soldiers themselves. The very men who had once been figures of authority, those who had passed through their village on their way to war, now seemed like faceless predators. There was no comfort in their uniforms, no reassurance in the orders they barked at each other. They were not protectors. They were invaders, and Carl was a target, just another innocent caught in the crossfire. The first soldier to step into the village was a young man, no older than Carl's brother, though Carl hadn't seen his brother in what felt like years. The soldier, his face hardened by the weight of war, scanned the broken streets with cold, calculating eyes. He seemed to move with an unsettling certainty, as though he had already seen this village 1,000 times over, each corner, each empty house, each piece of rubble. The other soldiers followed, moving in tight formations, their rifles held at the ready, their steps synchronized like machines. But for Carl, they were anything but machines. They were real men, men who had been through things he couldn't begin to understand. Carl's heart pounded in his chest as he watched from the darkness of the house, his hands trembling at his sides. The soldiers were close now, just a few feet away. He could hear their boots crunching on the gravel road, the muffled chatter of their voices. The fear that had gripped him for so long intensified, threatening to swallow him whole. Would they find him? Would they know he was there, hidden in the shadows of this crumbling house? Would they pull him out, drag him into the street, and take him away like they had taken so many others? The world outside seemed to shrink, the walls of the house pressing in on him. In the space of a heartbeat, the soldiers passed by. The tension in Carl's chest didn't ease, though. His pulse still raced, his hands still shook. The soldiers had arrived. The enemy was here. But what would come next? Would the worst of his nightmares unfold, or would they simply move on, leaving the village to continue its broken existence? He couldn't know. All he could do was wait, and pray that the British were nothing like the monsters he had imagined in his mind. The next morning, the sun rose over Wittenberg, its pale light seeping through the cracks in the walls of Karl's small home. The oppressive weight of fear that had settled in the village the previous day hadn't dissipated, but there was a strange, tentative quiet now. The air was thick with uncertainty, and the usual hum of everyday life had been replaced by an eerie stillness. Karl, still shaken from the previous day's events, lay in his bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the cracked ceiling above. His mind was a whirl of confusion and dread, as if he had stepped into a world where nothing made sense anymore. Outside, the soldiers' presence was undeniable. The British had arrived in force, setting up checkpoints around the village. Their vehicles, large, imposing, and designed for battle, were parked in the streets, blocking any attempt to escape. The men moved with the precision of soldiers who had long been hardened by war, their faces grim and taut, their eyes scanning every corner of the village for signs of threat. The British soldiers were everywhere now, patrolling the streets and moving through the ruins of homes that had once been vibrant. Their boots clattered against the cobblestones, their rifles slung over their shoulders like extensions of their bodies. Karl's first instinct was to hide. He knew he was just a boy, but in the chaos of war, that didn't matter. He had learned early on that survival was about being invisible, about staying out of sight. His heart raced as he crouched by the window, his small hands pressed against the cold, cracked glass. He watched, his breath shallow, as the soldiers walked through the streets, their faces hard and expressionless. They didn't seem like the monsters he had imagined in his nightmares. They were just men, like his father, like the other soldiers who had passed through the village in the early days of the war. But these men were different. They were not German. They were the enemy. Karl's mother had been in the kitchen when he had first heard the distant rumble of the British convoy, and now, after hours of tension, she had gone quiet too. She was like a shell of herself, moving slowly through the house as though she were a stranger to it. The weight of her silence hung heavily over him, and he found himself wishing, just for a moment, that she would speak, anything to break the suffocating silence that had taken over their lives. But there were no words. There was only the noise of soldiers outside, the rumble of their engines, the distant echoes of their commands. It wasn't long before a British soldier appeared at their doorstep. Karl's heart jumped in his chest, and he quickly backed away from the window, his pulse pounding in his ears. The soldier, a tall man with dark brown eyes and a weary expression, knocked on the door. Karl's mother, who had been standing by the fireplace, stiffened at the sound. She slowly made her way to the door, her face a mask of careful composure, hiding the fear that was surely there. Karl stayed still, his body tense, as he watched the interaction unfold from the shadows of the room. His mother opened the door just a crack, enough to speak but not enough for the soldier to step inside. The British man, his uniform a stark contrast to the dilapidated surroundings, looked her over for a moment before speaking in slow, measured tones, the accent foreign and unfamiliar to Karl's ears. "We need to check the house. Make sure there are no weapons or enemy soldiers hiding here," the soldier said, his voice calm but firm. Karl's mother nodded, her lips pressed tightly together as if the words had been rehearsed. She stepped aside, allowing the soldier to enter. Karl, still trembling with fear, retreated further into the shadows, his breath caught in his throat. He could feel his heart in his throat as he watched the soldier move through the house, his boots clicking softly on the wooden floors. The soldier didn't seem to be looking for anything in particular, just methodically checking each room with a gaze that never lingered for too long. It was strange, the way the soldier moved. There was no anger, no cruelty in his movements, just a weariness that seemed to seep from his very being. The soldier wasn't here to destroy, he wasn't here to bring pain. He was here to check, to ensure that no threat lay in wait. And yet, to Karl, this was terrifying in its own right. The soldier's presence was a reminder of everything he had been told to fear, the foreign invader, the enemy. But in that moment, as the soldier walked through the rooms, Karl could see that there was no malice in his actions. He was just a man, doing a job. The soldier's eyes scanned the room where Carl hid, his gaze flicking across the dusty furniture and the half-empty shelves. For a fleeting second, their eyes met, and Carl's stomach dropped. The soldier paused, his expression unreadable. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. And then, as if nothing had happened, the soldier continued on, his steps steady and unhurried. It was as if Carl didn't exist at all. The tension in the house remained thick, but it had shifted. The soldier's presence, so intimidating just moments ago, now seemed almost benign. The longer he stayed, the more Carl realized that the soldier was not what he had imagined. He had expected cruelty, brutality, perhaps even violence, but there was none of that. Instead, the soldier moved like someone who had long grown numb to the horrors around him, just another person trying to do his duty. It was an unsettling realization, one that Carl couldn't quite grasp. The fear that had ruled him for so long began to unravel, replaced by a disorienting sense of confusion. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. The enemy wasn't supposed to be human. After what seemed like an eternity, the soldier finally finished his check. He turned toward Carl's mother, who had been standing quietly in the corner, her hands clasped in front of her. The soldier gave a single nod, almost as if to acknowledge her silently. "We'll be moving on soon. Stay inside and don't go near the streets until we leave," he said, his voice still calm but with a slight edge to it. With that, he turned and left the house, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Carl remained hidden in the shadows, his body still trembling, his mind racing to process what had just happened. It wasn't the terror he had expected. It wasn't the violence or the destruction. Instead, it was a quiet, strange encounter that left him with more questions than answers. As the soldier's footsteps faded into the distance, Carl's mother let out a long, slow breath, as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. She turned to Carl, her face still drawn but with a faint trace of something else, relief, maybe, or perhaps exhaustion. She walked toward him, her movements slow and deliberate. "You're safe," she said softly, as if trying to convince herself as much as him. Carl nodded, though the words didn't quite reach him. Safe? How could they be safe when the world outside was crumbling? How could they be safe when the enemy was here, walking through their streets, searching their homes? His mind was filled with questions, with a sense of dread that hadn't quite subsided. But something had shifted. He had seen the soldier, heard his voice, and watched him move through the house. He had seen, in those brief moments, that the enemy was not a faceless monster, not the terrifying creature that haunted his nightmares. The soldier was a person, a man. And for reasons Carl couldn't explain, that realization unsettled him more than anything else. The hours passed, and the British presence in the village grew more pronounced. The soldiers moved through the streets, talking in low voices, their movements purposeful but not violent. The air was thick with tension, but there was a strange calm beneath it all, as if the soldiers were more focused on their mission than on causing harm. The villagers, still paralyzed by fear, watched from their windows, peering out cautiously to see what would happen next. Carl remained in the house, unable to tear himself away from the window, unable to stop thinking about the soldier. What did he want? Why had he been so calm, so detached? Had the war made him this way? Or had he always been like this? Was this what Carl had to look forward to when he grew older? This strange, weary detachment from everything around him? As the afternoon sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Carl realized something. He was no longer afraid of the soldier. But that, in itself, was terrifying. The very fear that had kept him alive, the fear that had helped him survive, was fading, and in its place, something else was growing. A sense of confusion, a sense of helplessness. What did it all mean? What was the truth of this war, of this world they were all caught in? Would he ever truly understand? The soldier was gone now, but Carl's mind continued to churn with the weight of the encounter. There were no answers, only more questions. And as the night settled over the village, bringing with it a strange, uneasy quiet, Carl realized that the war had already changed him. It had changed them all. As the days passed, the British soldiers remained in Wittenberg, their presence an unsettling constant. The once silent streets now echoed with the sounds of boots on cracked pavement, the hum of military vehicles, and the occasional murmur of soldiers' voices. Despite the tension that gripped the village, life continued in its disjointed, broken way. The villagers, still too afraid to speak openly, retreated into their homes, closing windows and doors, leaving only the occasional glance between them as they exchanged whispers of fear, of uncertainty, of what would happen next. Yet amid this, something had begun to shift in Karl. His earlier terror, the kind that had paralyzed him since the arrival of the British, began to give way to a strange, unsettling curiosity. He could no longer simply dismiss the soldiers as faceless enemies. The encounter with the young British soldier who had entered their home had shattered the image of the invaders as mindless monsters. The man had been nothing like the figures of cruelty that Karl had been taught to fear. In fact, the more Karl thought about it, the more he realized that there had been something profoundly human in the soldier's eyes. A weariness, an understanding as if he, too, was simply caught in the same dreadful situation, playing a part in a much larger, much more terrible story that neither side seemed able to control. Karl's mind was a battlefield in itself now. On one side were the memories of his mother's warnings, of the stories he'd heard about the British soldiers' mercilessness. On the other were the growing doubts that now plagued him after seeing the soldier in his own home. The man had not come with fire or anger, had not raised a hand to hurt him. He had simply done his duty, and in doing so, had exposed the lie Karl had lived with for so long. The enemy was not just an enemy, they were people too. People who had their own burdens, their own stories, their own lives that had been upended by this war, just as his own life had been. The more Karl dwelled on this, the more it unsettled him. He had seen too much to believe in the simplicity of his earlier ideas. The enemy, the invader, the destroyer. His world was no longer so clearly defined. The very foundation of his thoughts seemed to be crumbling beneath him, and the only thing that remained was the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Would he still be able to hold on to his fear? Would he still be able to view the soldiers outside as monsters when he had seen their humanity, their fragility? Could he still hate them, as he had been taught to do, now that he knew they were not so different from the people he had known before the war? Days turned into weeks, and the presence of the British soldiers became more normalized. They continued their patrols, inspected the villagers' homes, and kept a watchful eye on the streets, but there was no violence, no destruction, not in the way Karl had feared. In fact, many of the soldiers appeared to take some comfort in the routine. They were not just conquerors, they were workers, rebuilding the remnants of what had been torn down. When they weren't patrolling the streets, they were helping to repair the damaged homes, reinforcing the structures that had been bombed, or distributing food to the starving villagers. For Karl, this only deepened his confusion. The soldiers, whom he had expected to be the bringers of suffering, were instead the ones who, in many ways, were helping to patch together what had been broken. And as much as this confused him, it also unsettled him in ways he could not explain. They were not enemies in the way he had imagined. They were people who had seen death, had lived with loss, and yet, here they were, trying to heal the wounds that war had left in its wake. It was then that Karl encountered Private Thomas Hargrove again, the soldier who had come into his home that first day. This time, it wasn't an inspection, nor was it a moment of tension. It was an accidental meeting on a quiet afternoon. Karl had been wandering the outskirts of the village, trying to escape the suffocating weight of the war that pressed in on him from every side. He had found himself near the remnants of the old schoolhouse, where the ground was still littered with debris from the earlier bombardments. There, in the shadow of the broken building, he had seen the soldier once more. Private Hargrove was sitting on a pile of rubble, his back against a half-collapsed wall, looking out over the village with a blank expression, as if he were trying to find some peace in the broken landscape before him. Karl, instinctively, stepped back into the shadows, unsure of how to react. His fear flared up at the sight of the man, but there was something else too, something he hadn't expected. His curiosity. For a moment, the soldier did not notice Karl. But then, as if sensing something, Hargrove turned his head, and their eyes met across the distance. For a brief moment, Karl thought about running, about retreating into the safety of the village, but he didn't. Something in that quiet, thoughtful gaze made him hesitate, and before he knew it, he was walking toward the soldier, almost without thinking. When he was close enough, Hargrove smiled weakly, a tired but genuine gesture that startled Carl. The soldier looked as if he hadn't smiled in a long time, as if the weight of the war had stripped away much of the joy from his life. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" Hargrove said, his voice rough, as though he hadn't spoken much recently. "Not many come close to a soldier these days." Carl didn't know how to respond, so he remained silent. The soldier didn't seem to mind. He motioned for Carl to sit beside him, and though Carl hesitated, something inside him told him to sit. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered himself onto the rubble, just a few feet away from the soldier. They sat in silence for a while, neither one saying anything. The sound of wind rustling through the broken walls and the distant hum of the British trucks filled the quiet between them. Hargrove spoke first, his voice thoughtful but quiet. "I've seen a lot of places, boy. A lot of places ruined by this war. It's hard to find beauty in a world like this, isn't it?" Carl nodded, though he didn't know how to answer. He had never been asked a question like that before, and the answer he would have given once seemed so clear. There was no beauty in war, only pain and destruction. But now, after seeing how the soldiers had worked to rebuild, after witnessing their attempts to repair the damage, the idea of beauty was no longer so simple. Was there beauty in the way the soldiers worked? In the way they had managed to bring some semblance of order back to the village, despite the war? Could beauty exist in a world so broken? "Are you afraid, boy?" Hargrove asked suddenly, his eyes still fixed on the village. "Afraid of what's coming? Afraid of what we'll do here?" Carl felt the weight of the question settle on him, as if he had been waiting for it all along. He wasn't sure what to say. The fear was still there, a constant companion that he could never quite shake off, but now, with the soldier sitting beside him, it didn't feel so absolute. Carl said, his voice barely a whisper. I thought you would hurt us. I thought you'd burn everything down." Hargrove gave him a long, tired look before speaking. "I've seen enough destruction to last me a lifetime, lad. I don't need to add to it. I've watched entire villages burn. I've watched families fall apart, and for what? So we can win a war? A war that costs more than we could ever gain? I'm not here to destroy. I'm here to make things right, even if it's only a little." Carl didn't know what to say to that. The words felt too heavy, too complex for him to fully understand. He had been raised to believe that the enemy was always out to destroy. But here was this man, this soldier, who spoke as if he were trying to do the opposite. He spoke as though he had no desire to conquer, only to rebuild. The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable but filled with a deep, somber understanding between the two of them. In that moment, Carl realized something that had eluded him for so long. The war had blurred the lines between right and wrong, between enemy and ally. In this war, no one was entirely innocent, but neither was anyone entirely guilty. The soldiers were not just destroyers. They were people, each carrying the weight of their own stories, their own burdens, their own humanity. And in that fragile moment, as he sat beside the soldier who had once been nothing more than a terrifying figure in his imagination, Carl saw that truth more clearly than ever before. It was a truth that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A truth that would shape not just his view of the world, but of the soldiers who had once been his enemy. And perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest shock of all. To realize that sometimes, the greatest enemies were not the ones who fought against you, but the ones you could never fully understand. The days grew longer as the British soldiers continued to occupy Wittenberg. The streets, once filled with the frantic whispers of fear, now carried an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional sounds of military commands or the distant hum of British vehicles patrolling the roads. In the weeks that followed their arrival, the soldiers had slowly transformed from faceless invaders into something less easily understood, figures of authority, yes, but also of labor and compassion. Their presence no longer brought the same kind of terror that had gripped Carl in those first days. The soldiers, especially the ones stationed near the heart of the village, had shown a quiet determination to rebuild the broken landscape around them. They worked alongside the villagers, clearing debris, rebuilding walls, and offering aid when they could. But despite all of this, Carl couldn't escape the growing discomfort that gnawed at him, a discomfort born from the fact that this strange new reality seemed to blur the lines between what was right and wrong.